Harold sat alone in the grand dining room of his mansion, the massive chandelier above casting a warm golden light over the empty table. The room, once filled with the laughter and conversation of family gatherings, now echoed with a hollow silence. Harold, an elderly millionaire, had everything money could buy, but his wealth had not shielded him from the loneliness that had settled into every corner of his life. He sighed, gazing out of the large windows that overlooked the perfectly manicure. The years had not been kind to him, not in the way that truly mattered. It had been over a decade since he last saw his daughter, Emily. The bitter argument that tore them apart still replayed in his mind, as if it had happened yesterday. The details had blurred over time, but the pain remained sharp. Emily had stormed out of his life, vowing never to return, and Harold had let her go, too proud and stubborn to reach out and make amends. Regret gnawed at him, especially during these long, empty days when the weight of his solitude pressed down on him. One morning, as he shuffled through the mail, something caught his eye, a thick envelope with a law firm's seal. Harold's heart skipped a beat as he opened it, scanning the letter with growing unease. The letter, penned by Emily's lawyer, informed him of her recent passing. It was a shock that left him momentarily breathless, but the next lines were even more startling. Emily had a son, Ethan, whom Harold had never known about. The boy was living in poverty, with no family to turn to after his mother's death. The letter fell from Harold's trembling hands as the room seemed to close in around him. A grandson? How could he have been so oblivious? Guilt and curiosity intertwined, pulling him in different directions. He couldn't shake the image of a young boy, alone and struggling, while he lived in opulence. The revelation stirred something deep within him, a need to make things right, to somehow atone for his past mistakes. Determined to find Ethan, Harold wasted no time. He contacted a private investigator, a man known for his discretion and efficiency, and tasked him with finding his grandson. The days that followed were a blur of restless anticipation. Harold found himself pacing the halls of his mansion, unable to focus on anything but the thought of Ethan, this unknown grandson whose existence had been hidden from him for so long. The investigator's report came quicker than Harold expected. Ethan, a bright and resourceful boy of about 12, was living in a dilapidated apartment in a rundown neighborhood. The details of Ethan's life were heartbreaking. After Emily's death, he had been left to fend for himself, doing odd jobs to scrape together enough money for food and rent. Despite his dire circumstances, the investigator noted that Ethan was well liked in the community, kind, respectful, and determined to survive, even if the odds were stacked against him. Harold stared at the photograph of Ethan that the investigator had provided. The boy had Emily's eyes, but there was a toughness in his expression that came from a life of hardship. Harold's heart ached with a mix of sorrow and shame. How could he have let this happen? How could he have been so caught up in his own world that he missed the existence of his only grandchild? Harold knew he had to act, but he also knew this wouldn't be easy. The gulf between their lives was vast, and the boy had every reason to be wary of him. Yet Harold was determined. He arranged for a car and drove to the address the investigator had given him. The neighborhood was a far cry from the pristine surroundings of his mansion. Crumbling buildings, graffiti-covered walls, and the hum of a city that had seen better days. When Harold finally stood outside the door to Ethan's apartment, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the door, uncertainty gnawing at him. How would the boy react? Would he even want to see him? Summoning his courage, Harold knocked. The door creaked open, and there stood Ethan, smaller than Harold had imagined, but with a defiant glint in his eyes. The boy looked up at him, taking in the sight of this stranger in a tailored suit, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, though Harold could sense the undercurrent of suspicion. Harold cleared his throat, his voice betraying his nerves. "I'm your grandfather, Harold," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I came to see you." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't invite Harold in. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Ethan stepped aside, allowing Harold to enter the small, cluttered apartment. The place was a stark contrast to the mansion Harold called home. Bare walls, mismatched furniture, and an air of survival that clung to every corner. As Harold looked around, his heart sank further. This was where his grandson had been living, struggling to make it day by day while he had been surrounded by luxury. The thought was unbearable. They sat down, the tension between them palpable. Harold struggled to find the right words that could somehow make up for the years of absence, for the neglect that was never intentional but just as damaging. "I want to help you, Ethan," he said finally. "I want to make things right." Ethan looked at him, his face expressionless, but his eyes betrayed the storm of emotions within. "Why now?" he asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and mistrust. Harold had no easy answer. "Because I didn't know, and because it's never too late to do the right thing," he said, knowing how inadequate it sounded. The first meeting ended with more questions than answers, but Harold knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not ever. Harold sat in his study, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He stared at the photograph of Emily on his desk, her youthful face frozen in time, smiling brightly as if the world had never brought her pain. But Harold knew better. He closed his eyes, allowing the memories to wash over him, memories he had tried so hard to bury. It was a spring afternoon, years ago, when the argument that changed everything erupted. Emily, always fiercely independent, had come to him with news that shook the foundations of his carefully controlled world. She was pregnant. The father, a man Harold disapproved of, had no future, no means to support her, at least in Harold's eyes. He remembered the harsh words he'd spoken, words meant to protect her, but that only drove her away. "You're throwing your life away," he had shouted, his voice reverberating through the grand halls of the mansion. "If you walk out that door, don't have I." Emily had stood there, tears in her eyes, her hand protectively over her stomach. "Then this is goodbye, Father," she had said, her voice breaking, and then she was gone, out of his life, out of his control. Harold never heard from her again, not until that fateful letter. The regret was like a weight on his chest, growing heavier with each passing year. How could he have let his pride and stubbornness destroy the one relationship that truly mattered? He had been so focused on protecting her from what he saw as a mistake that he failed to see how much she needed him, how much he needed her. And now, there was Ethan, a living reminder of everything he had lost. Harold opened his eyes, the present moment rushing back. The study felt suffocating, filled with the ghosts of his past mistakes. His thoughts turned to Ethan, the boy who had inherited his daughter's strength and resilience, but who had also been forced to grow up too fast. Harold knew he had to make amends, but how could he, when every interaction with Ethan reminded him of his failure as a father? Meanwhile, Ethan was having his own internal struggle. Despite the kindness Harold had shown, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place in the opulent mansion. He missed his mother, missed the life they had, even if it was hard. At least it was familiar. Now everything was different. The food, the clothes, the way people talked. Everything reminded him that this wasn't his world. Ethan's nights were restless, filled with dreams of his mother's smile, her comforting voice telling him everything would be okay. But she was gone, and he was left to navigate this strange new life alone. Their interactions were often strained. Harold tried to connect with Ethan, but the boy's guarded nature and independent spirit made it difficult. Conversations were short and awkward, filled with long pauses and unspoken questions. Harold tried to engage Ethan with stories of his own childhood, but the boy listened politely, offering little in return. It was clear that Ethan was still trying to figure out where he fit into Harold's life, and whether he could trust the man who had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be family. Over the next few weeks, Harold and Ethan spent more time together, though the gap between them seemed Harold took Ethan on outings, trying to show him the world he had created for himself. A world of luxury and comfort. They visited art galleries, fine restaurants, and Harold even took Ethan to his country club, hoping to share the life he knew. But each attempt only seemed to push Ethan further away. The boy was polite, always saying thank you and please, but Harold could sense the discomfort in his posture, the way he would look away when people stared at them, his simple clothes standing out among the tailored suits and expensive dresses. One afternoon, Harold decided to take Ethan to the park, hoping that the open space and fresh air would make the boy feel more at ease. As they walked along the path, Harold noticed how Ethan's shoulders relaxed, how his eyes lit up when he saw other. For the first time, Ethan seemed like a normal kid, not weighed down by the expectations and pressures of fitting into Harold's world. "Do you like it here?" Harold asked, trying to sound casual, but there was an edge of desperation in his voice. Ethan nodded, kicking a small stone along the path. "Yeah, it's nice," he said. But there was something else in his voice, something Harold couldn't quite decipher. "Ethan," Harold began, choosing his words carefully. "I know this is all very different from what you're used to. I don't want you to feel like you have to change who you are to fit in here." Ethan stopped walking, his eyes fixed on the ground. "It's just, I'm not used to all this," he admitted quietly. "I don't know if I belong here." Harold felt a pang in his heart. "You do belong here," he said, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "But I don't want to force anything on you. We'll take things go." Ethan looked up at him, searching his face for sincerity. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice soft but earnest. That day marked a small shift in their relationship. Though they still had a long way to go, there was a newfound understanding between them. Harold began to see that it wasn't his wealth that would connect him to Ethan, but the simple, everyday moments they shared. He started to ask Ethan more about his life before, about his mother, and listened without judgment. Ethan, in turn, began to open up, sharing stories of his mother and their life together. The walls between them were still there, but they were slowly being chipped away, one conversation at a time. As the weeks passed, Harold found himself increasingly frustrated by the distance that remained between him and Ethan. Despite his best efforts to make Ethan feel at home, the boy continued to keep him at arm's length. Harold had tried everything he could think of, offering Ethan the best education, enrolling him in sports programs, and even buying him the latest gadgets. But none of it seemed to matter. Ethan accepted the gifts with a quiet politeness, yet there was no spark of joy in his eyes, no sign that he was beginning to feel comfortable in this new life. Harold knew that the root of the problem lay deeper than material comforts. He could see that Ethan was struggling to reconcile the stark differences between the world he had come from and the one he now found himself in. The mansion, with its marble floors and grand chandeliers, felt more like a museum than a home to Ethan. The servants, who catered to his every need, only made him feel more out of place, as if he were a guest in someone else's life. The expectations that came with Harold's wealth weighed heavily on Ethan, and the boy seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing day. But it wasn't just Ethan's discomfort that troubled Harold. He was haunted by his own guilt, the memories of how he had failed Emily and the fear that he was now failing Ethan in the same way. Every time he looked at Ethan, he saw the shadow of his daughter, and the regret that had been simmering for years now threatened to overwhelm him. Harold had hoped that by helping Ethan, he could somehow make up for the mistakes of the past, but instead, he found himself trapped in a cycle of doubt and frustration. One evening, after another strained dinner where Ethan barely spoke a word, Harold retreated to his study, feeling the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hoping it would dull the sharp edges of his thoughts, but the alcohol only seemed to amplify them. He couldn't escape the feeling that he was losing Ethan, just as he had lost Emily. Harold's mind drifted back to the day Emily had left, the harsh words he had spoken in anger, and the look of hurt in her eyes as she walked out the door. He had never tried to reach out to her after that, too proud to admit he had been wrong, and now he was paying the price for that pride. The thought of Ethan walking away from him the same way Emily had was unbearable, yet Harold didn't know how to stop it. The turning point came unexpectedly, one afternoon when Harold was going through some of Ethan's old things. He had asked his staff to gather whatever personal items they could find from Ethan's former apartment, hoping that something familiar might help the boy feel more at ease. As Harold sifted through the boxes, He came across a worn journal tucked away in the bottom of one of them. It was small and battered, the pages yellowed with age. But Harold recognized it immediately. It was Emily's. With trembling hands, Harold opened the journal, flipping through the pages filled with Emily's neat, looping handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane, daily thoughts, notes on Ethan's growth, and reminders of errands to run. But as Harold read on, the entries became more personal, more raw. Emily had written about her struggles as a single mother, her fears of not being enough for Ethan, and most painfully, her lingering anger toward Harold. She wrote about how she had tried to forgive him, but the hurt had run too deep, and in the end, she had kept her distance, both for her sake and for Ethan's. Harold's heart ached as he read the words of his daughter, words he was never meant to see. He had always known that Emily was angry with him, but he hadn't realized the depth of that anger, or how it had shaped her life, and Ethan's. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Ethan wasn't just struggling to adapt to a new life. He was carrying the weight of his mother's unresolved anger. Harold had thought that by offering Ethan a better life, he could make up for the past, but now he understood that it wasn't that simple. The wounds ran deeper than he had imagined, and they couldn't be healed with money or gifts. The journal was a stark reminder of the mistakes Harold had made, and the legacy of pain those mistakes had left behind. For the first time, Harold truly grasped the enormity of what he was up against. It wasn't just about providing for Ethan, it was about earning his trust, his respect, and perhaps in time, his forgiveness. But how could he do that when the boy saw him as the source of so much pain? Harold closed the journal, feeling a resolve build within him. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to make amends for it. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, that it would take time, patience, and a willingness to confront the painful truths he had been avoiding for so long. But he was determined to try, for Emily's sake and for Ethan's. The next day, Harold approached Ethan with a new determination. He didn't try to overwhelm the boy with more gifts or experiences. Instead, he sat down with Ethan and told him the truth about his regrets, his mistakes, and his hope that they could find a way forward together. It was a difficult conversation, filled with long silences and moments of tension, but it was also a turning point. For the first time, Harold wasn't trying to fix things with money. He was trying to connect with Ethan on a human level, as a grandfather who had made mistakes and was trying to make things right. Ethan listened, his expression guarded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a glimmer of understanding, perhaps even empathy. The conversation didn't solve all their problems, but it opened a door that had been firmly shut. Harold knew that there was still a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt that they were on the right path. The journey ahead would be challenging, but Harold was ready to face it no matter what it took. The tension between Harold and Ethan had been building for weeks, simmering beneath the surface of their interactions. Harold's attempts to connect with his grandson had often missed the mark, and Ethan's discomfort in his new surroundings only seemed to grow. They were like two planets orbiting each other, bound by gravity but never quite able to touch. One evening, after a particularly awkward dinner, the tension finally boiled over. Harold had arranged for Ethan to meet some of his business associates, hoping to introduce him to the world of wealth and opportunity that he believed could offer Ethan a brighter, but Ethan had been distant throughout the evening, his silence more pronounced than ever. When they returned to the mansion, Ethan stormed up to his room without a word, leaving Harold feeling more helpless than ever. Later that night, Harold knocked on Ethan's door. He hesitated for a moment, then entered the room to find Ethan sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. "Ethan, I can see that you're struggling," Harold began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know this isn't easy for you, but I'm just trying to help. I want to give you a life that..." "A life that what?" Ethan snapped, cutting him off. He turned to face Harold, his eyes flashing with anger. "A life that I don't want? A life where I'm supposed to be someone I'm not?" Harold was taken aback by the intensity of Ethan's outburst. "I'm just trying to make things better for you," he said more defensively than he intended. "Better? For who?" Ethan's voice trembled with the weight of his emotions. For you? Because you feel guilty about my mom? Because you think throwing money at me will make up for not being there for her? Harold felt as if the air had been knocked out of him. Ethan's words cut deep, exposing the raw truth he had been avoiding. Ethan, I made mistakes. I wasn't there for your mother, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now trying to make things right. Make things right? Ethan's voice broke, and tears welled up in his eyes. You can't make things right. My mom's gone, and she's never coming back. And now I'm stuck here, trying to live up to some idea of what you think I should be. But I'm not her, and I'll never be. Harold was silent, his heart heavy with the weight of Ethan's words. He realized in that moment how much pain Ethan had been carrying, pain that he himself had contributed to. He had been so focused on his own guilt and his need to make amends that he had failed to see how his actions were affecting Ethan. I'm sorry, Harold said softly, his voice trembling. I'm sorry for everything. I thought that by giving you all of this I could somehow make up for the past. But I see now that I was wrong. Ethan looked at him, his expression a mixture of anger and sadness. I don't want your money, he said quietly. I just want to feel like I belong somewhere. But I don't belong here, in this world of fancy dinners and expensive clothes. I belong with my mom, and she's gone. Harold felt a lump rise in his throat. Ethan, I know I can't bring her back, and I know I can't make up for the years we lost. But I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. Not as some rich old man trying to buy your love, but as your grandfather. If you'll let me. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He turned back to the window, wiping away the tears that had started to fall. Harold stood there, feeling more vulnerable than he ever had in his life, waiting for Ethan's response. The silence stretched on, filled with the weight of their shared pain. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for not being there for her. But I don't want to be alone either. Harold felt a flicker of hope in Ethan's words. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. You don't have to be alone, Harold said gently. We can figure this out together, one step at a time. The days that followed were a turning point for both Harold and Ethan. The confrontation had brought all their buried emotions to the surface, and though it had been painful, it also opened the door to a new beginning. Harold realized that if he was going to build a real relationship with Ethan, he needed to approach things differently. He couldn't just throw money at the problem or expect Ethan to conform to his world. He needed to meet Ethan where he was. Harold began to spend more time with Ethan in ways that didn't involve wealth or status. They took walks in the park, talked about Ethan's interests, and even spent an afternoon at the old neighborhood where Ethan had grown up. Harold listened more and spoke less, letting Ethan share his thoughts and feelings without interruption. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble, and Ethan started to open up more, sharing memories of his mother and the life they had before. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench in the park, Ethan turned to Harold. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, he began, his voice calm. About how you want to be there for me, not as someone trying to fix everything, but as my grandfather. Harold nodded, sensing that Ethan had more to say. I don't want to lose my mom's memory, Ethan continued, but I also don't want to live in the past forever. I think I'd like to give this a try. Us, I mean. Harold felt a wave of relief and gratitude. I'd like that too, Ethan. I know it won't be easy and we might stumble along the way, but I'm here for the long haul. We can figure this out together. From that day on, their relationship began to shift. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of tension and misunderstanding, but there was also a growing sense of trust and mutual respect. Harold stopped trying to mold Ethan into something he wasn't, and Ethan started to see that Harold's intentions, though flawed, came from a place of genuine care. They found common ground in their shared loss and in their desire to build something new, something that honored Emily's memory while allowing them to move forward. As the months passed, Harold and Ethan forged a bond that was different from what either of them had expected. It wasn't based on wealth or obligation, but on a shared understanding of what it meant to lose someone you loved and to find a way to keep living. They became a family, not in the conventional sense, but in a way that was real and meaningful to both of them. The story concluded on a quiet note, with Harold and Ethan visiting Emily's grave together. They stood in silence, each lost in their thoughts, but there was a sense of peace between them that hadn't been there before. As they left the cemetery, Harold placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and Ethan didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. They had come a long way, and though the road ahead would still have its challenges, they were ready to face it together, as grandfather and grandson, as family. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts in the comments. I love reading from you all.